History rarely pauses for individuals. It moves forward, crushing names beneath its weight, remembering only empires, armies, and victories measured in numbers. Yet there was a moment when history slowed, narrowed, and focused on a single man standing in the path of the greatest horde the world had ever seen. This was not a king surrounded by endless banners, nor a conqueror marching with certainty. This was one man facing a force so vast that resistance seemed irrational. The Horde had already rewritten maps. Cities burned in its wake. Armies vanished as if they had never existed. Wherever it moved, fear arrived first, spreading faster than soldiers ever could. To most of the world, the outcome was obvious. You did not fight this horde. You submitted, fled, or disappeared. Logic demanded survival, not defiance. History itself seemed to agree. No one had ever stopped them. No one had even slowed them for long. They were momentum given flesh, destruction made inevitable.
And yet, in the face of that certainty, one man chose to stand. We do not begin with his name, because names can mislead. Legends grow comfortable with time, smoothing away doubt and fear. In this moment, there was no legend, only a human being aware of his limits. He understood the imbalance. He saw the numbers. He felt the weight of what was coming. Defiance was not born from confidence, but from necessity. Behind him stood a world already cracking. Alliances were fragile. Leaders argued. Cities waited for orders that never came. If the Horde broke through here, there would be no next line of defense, no second chance. Civilization itself stood exposed. What made this moment extraordinary was not bravery alone, but choice. Faced with extinction or submission, this man rejected both. He did not believe victory was guaranteed. He believed only that surrender would erase everything that still mattered. This is the story of how one decision disrupted inevitability. How a single act of defiance forced history to hesitate, and how the greatest horde ever assembled met something it did not expect. To understand why this moment changed everything, we must first understand the force that made the world believe resistance was impossible. Because before this man could be remembered, before his defiance could echo through time, the Horde itself had to be understood, feared, and confronted as the unstoppable power it appeared to be first. They did not arrive as an army in the traditional sense. They arrived as a force of nature. The Horde moved faster than warning, faster than preparation, faster than belief. By the time cities understood what was coming, it was already too late. Walls that had stood for centuries were breached in days. Garrisons vanished in hours. Resistance collapsed before it could even organize. What made the Horde terrifying was not just its size, but its speed. They did not linger. They did not negotiate. They struck, moved on, and struck again, leaving devastation behind them like a widening shadow. Entire regions fell silent as news spread faster than refugees. Roads filled with fleeing civilians, carrying stories no one wanted to believe. Armies that rode out to meet them never returned. Some were overwhelmed in open battle, shattered by tactics they could not counter. Others broke before the fight even began, morale collapsing under the reputation that preceded the Horde. Fear became a weapon more effective than steel. Soldiers fought not against an enemy, but against inevitability. Cities fell, one after another. Markets burned. Libraries were reduced to ash. Temples and palaces were stripped bare or destroyed. Civilization, carefully built over generations, unraveled in weeks. The Horde did not simply conquer land, it erased identity. Languages disappeared, traditions ended. What remained was silence and obedience. The psychological impact was devastating. Rulers abandoned capitals.
Allies turned on each other. Treaties dissolved overnight. No one trusted defenses anymore. No one believed preparation mattered. The Horde seemed immune to exhaustion, immune to loss, immune to fear itself. Every victory made them stronger, more confident, more unstoppable. To those watching from a distance, the pattern was clear. Wherever civilization stood firm, annihilation followed. Wherever resistance rose, it was crushed. Survival appeared to require submission. Many chose it willingly, believing that compliance was the only rational path left. This was not just warfare, it was extinction through momentum. The Horde represented a future where force decided everything, where culture existed only at the mercy of power. Against such a force, courage felt meaningless, strategy felt irrelevant, hope felt dangerous. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side stood order, history, and human achievement. On the other stood speed, brutality, and absolute dominance.
Civilization moved slowly, bound by rules and traditions. The Horde moved freely, unrestrained by hesitation or mercy. By the time the Horde reached the edge of the known world, its reputation alone was enough to empty cities. People fled before banners even appeared. The idea that anyone could stop them felt absurd. And yet, as annihilation advanced, it carried with it a fatal assumption: that fear would always work, that resistance would always fail, that no one would ever choose defiance over survival. It was that assumption that set the stage for the moment when inevitability would finally be challenged. The world the Horde advanced into was already exhausted. Long before the first riders appeared on the horizon, cracks had begun to spread through kingdoms and alliances that once believed themselves secure. Old rivalries had weakened unity. Promises were made and broken so often that trust itself had become a liability. When danger finally arrived, no one stood together. Leadership faltered at the worst possible moment. Kings hesitated, councils argued, generals disagreed over strategy while the threat grew closer with every passing day. Decisions that demanded speed were buried beneath caution and fear. Some leaders clung to pride, others to denial, but few to responsibility. The result was paralysis. Alliances that should have held collapsed under pressure. States that once swore mutual defense closed their borders instead. Armies were withheld, not because they were needed elsewhere, but because no one wanted to be first to fall. Survival became a solitary pursuit. Cooperation felt like a risk no one could afford. Among the people, hope thinned quickly. Refugees brought stories that sounded unreal until they were repeated too often to ignore. Villages emptied overnight. Trade slowed, then stopped. Farmers abandoned fields. Merchants hid their goods. The rhythm of daily life fractured as fear replaced routine.
Many believed resistance no longer made sense. Logic argued against it. Why fight a force that had never been defeated? Why sacrifice lives for a cause already lost? Surrender, to many, appeared not as cowardice but as realism. Better to exist under domination than vanish entirely. Faith in institutions eroded. Walls no longer promised safety. Armies no longer inspired confidence. Even religion struggled to explain what was happening. People searched for meaning in a world that felt like it was collapsing faster than understanding could keep up. This was the environment in which the Horde advanced, not into strength, but into fragmentation, not into unity, but into fear. Civilization was not standing tall, ready to defend itself. It was already on its knees. And yet, within this collapse, something unexpected stirred. Not a movement, not an army, just a figure who had not yet drawn attention, who did not command overwhelming loyalty or unquestioned authority.
Someone watching the same failures, the same fear, and reaching a different conclusion. At first, his presence barely registered. In a world dominated by empires and annihilation, one man meant nothing, or so it seemed. But as the logic of surrender tightened its grip on everyone else, he began to see what others refused to consider. That resistance did not need certainty. It only needed someone willing to choose it when no one else would. History prefers clean stories.
It remembers conquerors, crowns, and victories that seem inevitable in hindsight. It does not linger on hesitation, doubt, or failure narrowly avoided. That is why this man almost disappeared from memory. He did not fit the shape of a legend. He was not born into overwhelming power. He did not command endless resources or unquestioned loyalty. In fact, many doubted he should have been in command at all. His authority was fragile, shaped more by circumstance than destiny. Rivals questioned his judgment.
Allies questioned his strength. Enemies barely noticed him. Physically, he was unremarkable. Politically, he was constrained. He inherited problems rather than advantages. Where others ruled through fear or wealth, he ruled through persistence. Every decision he made was scrutinized. Every failure lingered longer than his successes. He carried the weight of expectation without the tools usually granted to those expected to win. Isolation defined him. While other leaders relied on councils and armies, he often stood alone with his thoughts. Advisors offered conflicting counsel. Some urged surrender, others delay. Few believed resistance was possible. Even fewer believed he was the one capable of leading it. Doubt surrounded him, both external and internal. This is where myth diverges from truth. Legends portray unwavering confidence, heroes who never question their path. The reality was far more human. He questioned himself constantly. He understood the risks better than anyone. He knew that failure would not just mean defeat, but total erasure. His name, his people, his world would vanish into footnotes, if remembered at all. What separated him from others was not certainty, but responsibility. He saw what surrender would cost, not immediately, but over generations. Submission promised survival, but at the price of identity. Resistance promised nothing at all, except the chance to choose how the end would come. He did not believe he was destined to win. He believed only that someone had to try. In a time when leaders protected themselves first, that belief was radical. It made him dangerous, not because he was powerful, but because he was willing to accept consequences others avoided. The world did not see him as a hero then. He was seen as stubborn, impractical, even reckless. History would later debate his competence, his motives, his methods. But in that moment, labels mattered less than action. He stood at the edge of annihilation, flawed and uncertain, aware that no one would save him. And in that isolation, stripped of myth and comfort, he made a choice that would force history to remember him, even if it tried not to. Because the next decision he faced would define whether he faded into obscurity or became the man who defied the greatest horde the world had ever known. Reason had a clear voice, and it spoke loudly. Every calculation pointed in the same direction. The horde was larger, faster, and undefeated. Supplies were limited. Allies were unreliable. Time was working against them. By every standard measure of leadership, surrender was not cowardice, it was prudence. Advisors reinforced the logic relentlessly. They brought reports of fallen cities, of armies erased in days. They spoke of mercy offered to those who submitted early, of lives spared through obedience. Resistance, they warned, would invite annihilation. Better to bend than break. Better to live under rule than die for pride. Allies echoed the same message. Some quietly withdrew support, unwilling to share the consequences of defiance. Others urged delay, hoping the storm would pass elsewhere. Promises were softened, commitments hedged. No one wanted to be remembered as the last to fall. Survival had become the highest virtue. Circumstances agreed. Defenses were thin. Resources were strained. Morale wavered. Every rational framework said the same thing: fight and lose everything. Surrender and preserve what remains. History offered countless examples where submission ensured continuity. Entire peoples had survived conquest by adapting, by enduring. Even among the people, surrender felt tempting. Fear does that. It reframes dignity as a luxury, courage as recklessness.
Parents wanted safety for their children. Merchants wanted stability. Priests spoke of preservation rather than sacrifice. The pressure to yield was not malicious, it was human.
This was the true battle, before any weapon was raised. Not steel against flesh, but logic against resolve. Survival through submission promised certainty. Dignity through resistance promised nothing but risk. One path was clear and safe. The other was dark and uncertain. Voices grew louder as the moment approached. Each warning carried urgency, each argument sharpened by fear of being wrong too late. The weight of expectation pressed down, demanding a decision that would spare others from responsibility if it failed. He understood all of this. He did not dismiss the arguments. He felt their weight more than anyone. He knew surrender would spare lives in the short term. He knew resistance might destroy everything. That knowledge haunted him in sleepless hours and quiet moments when no one was watching. Yet beneath the logic lay a deeper question. What kind of survival was being offered? Existence without autonomy, peace without identity, a future shaped entirely by someone else's will.
Surrender would not end fear. It would institutionalize it, passing it forward as inheritance. This was the line logic could not cross. Numbers could predict outcomes, but they could not measure meaning. Advisors spoke of survival as if it were neutral, but he saw its cost extending far beyond his lifetime. What would remain after submission would not be the world he was responsible for protecting. Choosing resistance was not a rejection of reason. It was a refusal to let reason erase everything worth preserving. He was not choosing death, he was choosing agency. The moment demanded an answer. Delay would decide nothing. Silence would become surrender by default. And so against counsel, against probability, against history itself, he made a choice that logic could not justify. In doing so, he accepted that dignity might be the only victory left worth fighting for. Even alone, against overwhelming odds, forever remembered by history itself, across generations and centuries ahead.
Desperation strips strategy down to its core. With surrender rejected and conventional victory impossible, the hero was forced to look beyond everything warfare normally rewarded. He understood one brutal truth. If he fought the Horde the way wars were usually fought, he would lose quickly and completely. Strength against strength was suicide. Numbers against numbers was extinction. So the plan began with breaking rules. Instead of meeting the Horde in open ground where its speed and mass were unstoppable, he chose terrain that punished scale. Narrow approaches, restricted movement, spaces where coordination mattered more than numbers. This alone defied every expectation. Most commanders sought room to maneuver. He sought confinement. Next came timing. The Horde thrived on momentum. It struck fast, rested little, and relied on overwhelming shock. The plan required patience instead, waiting until exhaustion dulled precision, waiting until confidence hardened into carelessness.
It meant allowing fear to spread among his own people, while trusting that the enemy's arrogance would deepen with every unchallenged advance. Resources were used differently as well. Rather than concentrating forces for a decisive clash, he dispersed them. Smaller units, flexible positioning, rapid movement over rigid formations. To traditional minds, it looked like weakness. In reality, it was preparation for chaos. If communication failed, the plan still held. If leaders fell, others could act independently. Every step increased risk. Coordination had to be perfect without appearing organized. Soldiers had to act decisively without knowing the full plan. Surprise had to be maintained against an enemy that believed surprise was impossible. One mistake would expose everything. Advisors were alarmed. Some argued the plan invited disaster. Others accused him of gambling with extinction. They were not wrong. The margin for error was non-existent.
If the Horde adapted even slightly faster than expected, the strategy would collapse instantly. What made the plan most dangerous was what it demanded from people: absolute trust without full understanding. discipline under uncertainty, courage without reassurance. He could not promise victory. He could not even promise survival. All he could offer was purpose. The strategy also depended on the psychology of the Horde. Years of success had trained them to expect fear, flight, and submission. This plan relied on breaking that expectation at the worst possible moment. Confusion, not destruction, was the real objective. If the Horde lost coherence, its strength would fracture. Still, nothing about this felt heroic. It felt fragile, temporary, like holding back a flood with bare hands. He knew that once the first move was made, retreat would be impossible. Commitment itself became the final weapon. There would be no second chance, no revised plan, no reinforcement.
As preparations moved quietly into place, doubt lingered everywhere. Soldiers whispered, leaders hesitated. The weight of what was being attempted pressed down on every decision. Failure would not just mean defeat, it would mean the strategy itself would be remembered as madness. Yet that was the paradox. Only a plan that looked impossible could challenge an enemy that believed itself unstoppable. Only by abandoning safety could any hope exist at all. When the final orders were given, they carried no promises. Only a single, unspoken understanding passed through every rank. If this failed, nothing remained to try. And with that knowledge settled heavily in the air, the first irreversible step was taken, setting events in motion that could no longer be stopped. The clash did not begin with ceremony or warning. It began with movement. Dust rose on the horizon, then grew into a wall of motion that swallowed the land. The Horde arrived as it always did, fast, loud, and overwhelming.
Thousands moved as one, their presence alone enough to shake resolve. For a moment, it felt as if the earth itself was advancing. The sound came first, hooves pounding, voices shouting, weapons clashing against armor in anticipation. The sheer scale defied comprehension. This was power in its purest form, stripped of restraint. To face it directly felt less like battle and more like standing before a natural disaster. Fear surged through the defenders, sharp and immediate. No speech could remove it, no belief could soften it. Men tightened grips on weapons, aware that hesitation meant death. Every instinct screamed to run. The Horde had broken stronger armies than this without slowing. And yet resistance held. The hero's plan unfolded not with thunder, but with precision. Movements were deliberate. Positions held longer than felt comfortable. The defenders did not charge. They waited, forcing the Horde to commit fully before revealing anything unexpected. Seconds stretched painfully.
The distance closed. When the first impacts came, they were brutal. Steel met flesh, wood shattered. The force of the Horde crashed forward, consuming space with terrifying speed. The raw power was undeniable. Wherever they struck directly, defenders were driven back. The ground shook beneath the weight of the assault. But something was wrong. The Horde expected collapse. Instead, it found resistance that bent without breaking. The defenders gave ground in some places, only to harden in others. Movements that looked like retreat drew the enemy deeper, tighter, closer together. Momentum carried the Horde faster than coordination could follow. Chaos began quietly. Signals were missed, orders overlapped. Units surged ahead without support. What had always been strength, speed, and aggression started to blur into disorder. The Horde pressed harder, trying to overwhelm through force alone. That was when the resistance struck back. Not everywhere, not all at once. Precisely where it hurt most. Smaller units moved with sudden purpose, exploiting gaps, attacking flanks, vanishing before retaliation could land. Confusion spread unevenly, but once it started, it fed on itself. The battlefield dissolved into fragments. Dust thickened the air. Visibility dropped. Shouts replaced commands. The Horde's raw power remained, but its direction faltered. Strength without control began colliding with itself. For the defenders, fear transformed. It did not disappear, but it focused. Each successful action sharpened belief.
Each enemy misstep confirmed that the impossible might be bending. They fought not as conquerors, but as survivors who had found rhythm inside chaos. The hero moved within the storm, not untouched, not invincible, but aware. Every decision mattered. He could feel the battle teetering between annihilation and opportunity. There was no space for hesitation now. Commitment was total. The Horde pushed again, harder, angrier. Loss was unfamiliar.
Resistance infuriating. They struck with the same ferocity that had crushed others, but the battlefield no longer responded the way it should have. Power surged forward, then folded back on itself. Time fractured, moments stretched, then vanished. Pain, noise, motion blended into instinct. Men fought without thinking, driven by survival and belief rather than orders. The clash had become something new, something neither side fully controlled. And buried inside the chaos was a realization spreading through the Horde for the first time. This was not breaking as expected. The defenders were still there, still fighting, still choosing resistance with every breath. The raw power of the greatest Horde ever assembled was meeting something it had never faced before. Not greater force, but calculated refusal. As the clash raged on, one truth became impossible to ignore. This battle would not end the way history predicted.
And once that understanding took hold, the balance began to shift in ways no one had prepared for, pulling both sides toward a moment that would decide far more than victory or defeat. The breaking point did not come with a dramatic collapse. It crept in through hesitation. A unit slowed. Another advanced too far. Orders conflicted. What had once been seamless movement began to fracture under pressure the Horde had never truly faced before. A miscalculation here, a delay there. One commander pushed forward, expecting support that never arrived. Another held back, waiting for signals, lost in dust and noise. These were small errors, insignificant on their own. Together, they began to unravel the machinery that had always carried the Horde to victory. The Horde relied on momentum. Speed had always erased resistance before it could adapt. But now, momentum was colliding with resistance that refused to disappear. The faster they pushed, the tighter space became. Units crowded together.
Paths narrowed, coordination faltered, strength compressed into confusion. The hero saw it before anyone else did. He did not celebrate it. He recognized it for what it was, a fragile opening that could vanish in seconds. His response was immediate. Order shifted. Pressure increased precisely where hesitation appeared. He did not seek destruction. He sought imbalance. The defenders surged in focused bursts, not everywhere, only where cracks showed. Smaller forces struck exposed flanks, then withdrew before the Horde could respond. The goal was never to overpower, only to disrupt. Each disruption multiplied the next. Panic spread unevenly. Some warriors fought harder, driven by instinct and fury. Others hesitated, sensing something was wrong but unable to name it. The certainty that had always carried them forward began to dissolve. Confidence fractured into individual fear. For the first time, the Horde reacted instead of dictated. Leadership struggled to reassert control.
Signals were missed. Messengers failed to reach their targets. Commands contradicted one another. The chain that bound thousands into a single force snapped into fragments. Without unity, power became weight. The contrast on the battlefield reached its peak. On one side, overwhelming numbers struggling to move with purpose. On the other, fewer fighters acting with clarity. Force collided with mind. Habit collided with adaptation. The hero pressed the advantage, not through reckless aggression, but through relentless pressure. He forced the Horde to make decisions faster than it was trained to handle. Every second demanded reaction. Every hesitation deepened collapse. Then came the moment of realization. It passed silently, unnoticed by most. A commander recognized retreat might be necessary. Another saw victory slipping beyond reach. The idea itself spread like shock. Retreat had never been part of the Horde's identity. The thought alone disrupted everything.
Once doubt entered, it multiplied. Some units pulled back instinctively, opening gaps. Others surged forward blindly, colliding with allies. What had once been unified motion became chaos feeding on itself. The Horde was still vast, still dangerous, but no longer unstoppable. For the defenders, belief ignited. Fear remained, but it no longer ruled. Every successful strike reinforced purpose. Every enemy misstep confirmed that inevitability had been broken. They were no longer resisting to survive. They were acting to decide. The battlefield reflected the shift. Lines blurred, formations dissolved. Dust and noise swallowed certainty. The Horde fought on, but without direction, without inevitability. This was the decisive moment. Not when the first blow landed, but when belief changed sides. When the many realized force alone was no longer enough. When one mind, guiding fewer hands, bent the course of thousands.
From this point forward, the outcome was no longer a question of if, but of how much would be lost before the truth was accepted. What happened on that battlefield did not end with the Horde's retreat. Its true impact unfolded slowly, reshaping the world in ways that were not immediately visible. At first glance, it looked like a single act of resistance, a rare upset in an age dominated by force. In reality, it marked a turning point that altered political balance, military thinking, and the psychology of power itself. Politically, the defiance disrupted inevitability. Until that moment, expansion by overwhelming force had appeared unstoppable. States believed survival depended on submission or alliance with the strongest power available. This victory shattered that assumption. It proved that dominance could be challenged, even without superior numbers. As news spread, rulers recalculated. Resistance became a viable option again, not a fantasy.
That shift alone changed how power was negotiated for generations. Militarily, the consequences were profound. Armies studied the battle not for its scale, but for its method. It demonstrated that terrain, timing, and adaptability could neutralize raw strength. Commanders began to rethink doctrine. Flexibility gained value over rigid formations. Strategy began to account for psychology as much as logistics. The idea that a smaller force could dictate the terms of engagement reshaped warfare far beyond this single conflict. Culturally, the impact ran deeper still. The victory preserved societies that would have been erased or absorbed. Languages continued, traditions survived. Political systems had time to evolve instead of being replaced. This was not about preserving perfection, but preserving possibility. Without that pause and expansion, the diversity that shaped future civilizations might never have existed.
There is a popular myth that history always bends toward progress, that civilizations rise because they are destined to. This moment challenges that belief. Progress was not guaranteed. Survival was not automatic. Everything hinged on a decision made when surrender made more sense than resistance. The truth is uncomfortable, but powerful. History is not shaped only by empires and numbers. It is shaped by moments when individuals refused to accept inevitability. This was one of those moments, not because it created immediate peace or lasting dominance, but because it kept the future open. That is why this defiance mattered. It did not end conquest forever. It did not create a perfect world, but it broke the spell of inevitability. It reminded the world that power could be resisted, that force could be outthought, and that one decision, made at the edge of extinction, could echo far beyond its time. History remembers outcomes, but it is shaped by choices.
Long after the dust settled and the Horde moved on, what remained was not just a victory, but a lesson that refused to fade. This man did not build an empire. He did not conquer vast lands or rule through fear. His legacy rests on a single decision made when surrender was easier, safer, and widely accepted. What makes him matter today is not that he won, but why he chose to resist. He understood that survival without agency is a quiet form of extinction. By refusing inevitability, he preserved more than territory. He preserved the right of societies to decide their own future, even when the odds made that choice seem irrational. Across centuries, leaders, strategists, and ordinary people have returned to moments like this for guidance, not because they offer guarantees, but because they offer clarity. Power is never absolute. Dominance is never permanent. Every system, no matter how overwhelming, depends on belief as much as force. Once belief fractures, change becomes possible.
This is why his story endures. It reminds us that history does not belong exclusively to the strong, the numerous, or the victorious by default. It belongs to those who act when action appears meaningless, those who accept responsibility when outcomes cannot be promised. In modern times, his legacy powerful. He was not driven by certainty. He was driven by refusal. Refusal to let fear decide everything. When faced with extinction or submission, he chose something rarer. He chose to decide. That choice rippled forward, shaping futures he would never see. And it continues to matter, because the conditions that test resolve never disappear. Different names, different powers, same pressure to surrender agency for safety. History is not written by numbers alone.
It is written by moments when someone chooses to stand, knowing they might fail, but refusing to disappear quietly. That is why this man still matters today.